So, welcome back to the Motor Asha podcast. Um, we've been doing these podcasts every every month, and it's I mean, while we are doing it, we didn't realize we've actually done 25 of them over the past year. Yes, and we've had 1,500th podcast download, which is exciting and so glad to hear that there are people who are listening to our podcast and they find it informative. So stick to it, keep listening. Uh, on this podcast, we thought we'd get a little more technical knowledge. So we popped into one of India's renowned garages, Slipstream Performance in Pune, and we've heard so much about these guys, especially Kunal, with all the servicing and maintenance and the repair works that he does with super bikes and premium motorcycles. I mean, for us, we've seen him do some really interesting work, and there's a lot of things, just simple things like even getting your suspensions set, making sure all the things are put into place systematically, worked on the right way. So we thought we'd pop into Kunal's garage, Slipstream, and speak to him about something that is not neglected but not really looked at very seriously, although it's a very serious component and a serious maintenance job that needs to be done on your engine. And we thought let's get him to answer the questions that we had, and get you guys to actually listen to this and make sure that you keep doing such maintenance on your bikes regularly. It definitely makes a very big difference to the way the engine's gonna keep running the way it's supposed to run efficiently, and get more miles on it the right way without it breaking down. So I'm gonna welcome Kunal from Slipstream. Our topic on this podcast is three critical elements that you should not be missing out on your engine maintenance. So welcome, Kunal.
Hey, thanks, Shoaib. It's always good to be, on the Motor Asha podcast. I think it helps educate riders to better understand their motorcycle. So for today's podcast, I thought I'd get a little technical, but stick around. I think it should shed some light on a few misunderstood aspects of regular maintenance. So I actually did give this a lot of thought, and I think I've come down to basically talking about three critical maintenance procedures that you need to follow on any EFI motorcycle. I won't get into motorcycles with carburetors. We see more and more fuel injected motorcycles. I'm going to stick with that. And the three things I want to talk about are checking and adjusting your valve clearances, replacing your fuel filter or filters, and fuel injector cleaning. So what I find from my experience is, these are generally overlooked as a routine part of maintenance. And this is especially as a bike gets older, you really need to start looking at these three things. Okay, so like I pointed out earlier, this is where it's going to get slightly technical. But, I think this will help in the overall understanding why you need to do all this. So first things first, I'm going to explain a little bit about how your engine runs and, how these three components are interconnected. So basically, your motorcycle needs a very specific air-fuel ratio or mixture that's sprayed into the engine for it to operate efficiently. This happens over the entire rev range. And the fuel mixture is timed to be sprayed as a very fine, mist. It goes into the cylinder via the manifold port, and this happens when your inlet valve or valves opens. This is basically the manifold port is where your throttle body attaches to your cylinder head with the the rubber stub that bolts onto the engine. Okay, so let's get back to it. So now that you've sprayed your fuel mixture into the cylinder, what's going to happen is that the fuel ignites and it's consumed at a particular, or required burn rate. This is going to produce the best power and the lowest emissions for that particular load and RPM. And for this to happen, you need a fuel system that basically pumps and injects the fuel at a high pressure, which causes a nice atomized fuel spray. You also need a valve train, Okay, you need something that's going to actuate an inlet and exhaust valve. So this is going to allow your air fuel mixture to flow into the cylinder, and the burnt gas to basically flow out of the cylinder. So these are the basics that works. And also you got to remember that your valves are going to be closed during the engine cycle. This is so that the mixture that you've injected into the cylinder is going to be sealed inside that cylinder, and when the piston comes up, it's going to compress it, and basically you have an ignitable gas that's ready to combust. Okay, so now that we have a very clear idea of what we're looking for, I'm going to get into the why and how we go about ensuring your engine will do this at max efficiency throughout its life. So I'm going to start out with talking about fuel filters. I find that this is somehow something that's not really looked into with a lot of the big bikes out there. So we all know the quality of petrol in India can be sketchy at times. In the context of this podcast, I'm not going to get into octane ratings. I know a lot of people talk about octane ratings, but I'm going to look only at or more at contaminated fuel. So this is more of a problem as you go into the mountains or, maybe fill at smaller pumps on the highway. Fuel filters are designed to prevent smaller particles. I think it's roughly about 10 microns across from the fuel tank, getting into the fuel pump and then finally into the fuel injector. So many times at the shop we see that rust from the tank also getting into the fuel lines causes problems. So this is why most motorcycles have a fuel system, have a filter at the pump, and this is every motorcycle has a filter at the fuel pump, and a lot of them, and you see more and more motorcycles now have fuel filters after the fuel pump. So this is basically an inline fuel filter, and this is what needs to be changed at a regular interval. You also have smaller inline filters inside the injector, but those get cleaned at a later stage. Yeah, so the fuel filters is critical. It's going to prevent contaminants from being pumped to the injector, and your injector, depending on the design, can have anything from 4 to 12 really fine orifices on its nozzle. And the fine orifices you atomize the fuel while it's under pressure from the fuel pump. Okay, so the fuel filter is going to be critical to making sure it does not let dirt into the fuel pump rotors as well as the injector orifices. Okay, so you're going to eventually have a fuel filter doing its job. It's going to get loaded and clogged over time. So you're going to see a drop in fuel pressure in the fuel rail, over a period of time. The normal fuel pressure that we generally see on motorcycles is around 40 psi. And if this starts dropping off, as it will once the fuel filter starts getting clogged, you will find that this affects the injector spray pattern. And below a certain threshold, it just cannot support the required spray pattern, and you're going to start to see problems with running. And we see problems like cold starting. It'll be more difficult to start. You'll have to crank the bike more. You'll have problems with the idling. You'll also get high emissions because the spray pattern is not as it should be, and you'll have bigger droplets being injected into the cylinder. I find that the fuel filter is really overlooked, and in many cases it's just due to availability of parts. A lot of guys do want to change their fuel filters, but they aren't easily available. But majority of the time, we also find that technicians either have no idea that this motorcycle requires a fuel filter change. So this brings me to the next critical component in line, and that's going to be the fuel injector. So the fuel injector is the final part of the fuel system and is responsible for making sure your engine gets the correct air-fuel ratio based on engine demand. So you got to think about it, guys. So your fuel injector is basically operating millions of times over the life of your engine. So injectors, generally last a very long time, and I personally have never changed an injector because it's failed till date. But they do require maintenance. And this is one component that we find no service schedule mentioned in the manual. But this isn't to say that they don't require any maintenance. So what we found in Indian conditions is that you should have them ultrasonically cleaned at least every 35,000 kilometers, and maybe earlier. Maybe at earlier intervals, like I mentioned earlier, if you are riding to offbeat destinations or maybe into the hills, or even if you've parked your bike for an extended period of time, especially like after the lockdown, we've done a lot of motorcycles. We've had to clean the injectors ultrasonically. And this happens because, if you start your motorcycle and run all gas through the system, you generally don't want to use fuel that's older than 3 months, guys. You get a gummed up or contaminated fuel injector. And what happens is this: once the injector gets gummed up, you can see fuel dribbling into the cylinder instead of being atomized. Or the spray pattern can become a little uneven. And this will basically cause similar problems as described when you have a contaminated fuel filter. So the reason I'm talking about this is I find most riders are unaware you need to service injectors. And a lot of the technicians or owners, motorcycle owners, don't really want to get into cleaning them because, like, on some motorcycles, they're really hard to access. So if you're on, taking an injector off a single cylinder motorcycle, they're generally easier to work on. But if you have a really complicated, inline four or a bigger motorcycle or something which is very compact, they can be a little difficult to access. So finally, last but not least, I'm going to talk about the inlet and exhaust valves. I'm going to explain a little bit about how they operate. And, also then I'm going to get into why we do the valve clearances. So a very basic analogy for the valve or valves is a water tap. The valves on your engine are like taps that allow the air and fuel mixture and burn gases to flow in and out of the engine only when they open. So when the both valves are closed, they're supposed to seal the air fuel mixture inside your cylinder so that it can be compressed and ignited on the power stroke. So, when the valves are closed, just like a water tap, you do not want any of the mixture trapped inside the cylinder leaking past the valves. So, I'm going to explain a few more things. And a few things to remember when we talk about valves are, they run at half engine speed. So for an engine running at 5,000 RPM, each valve is going to open and close 2,500 times a minute. They have a linear up and down motion and have to do this hundreds of times a second. And they're subjected to the heat and pressure of the combustion gases. So you got to remember, you typically see inlet valve temperatures of 550 degrees and the exhaust valves around 900 degrees. So the valve seals against the valve seat in the cylinder, and most of the heat they absorb is conducted through the valve seat into the cylinder head. The exhaust valves actually help conduct 70-75% of the heat that's in the combustion chamber to the head and then into the water jacket and radiator. So to sum it up, the valves inside your engine have to move up and down hundreds of times a second while being subjected to immense heat and pressure for thousands of kilometers. So you got to keep this in mind. It's all going to be important in just a minute when I get into, valve clearances. So, if you talk about specified clearances, why are they so important? We hear this, term thrown around, piston to bore clearance or valve clearance. So you got to remember that, everything in your engine tends to get hot because of the combustion process. The heat causes parts to expand at different rates based on the material that they're made from and where they're located in the engine. All moving parts, are going to have some working clearance, and this basically takes into account how much they will expand and contract during the heat cycle. So it's for this reason clearances are always specified when the engine is cold. If you read your manual and you check on a valve clearance, it's always going to specify it when the engine is cold. And for valve clearances that need adjustment, we can have a valve that's commonly referred to as too tight or too loose. So guys, I mean, I hear this question all the time. So people tell me, but the valve clearances were initially set at the factory. So why do I need to check my valve clearance? And when you think about this, it's all in the nature of how the valves operate or how they're designed to operate. So there's, like I said earlier, there's linear up and down motion, plus the heat and pressure tend to cause the valve seats to recess into the head. Now, if you think about it, your valve is opening and closing hundreds of times a second. Every time it closes, there's a hammering effect of the valve down onto the valve seat. And this causes the clearance that you initially set between the valve stem and the camshaft to gradually reduce over time. If this reduces past the tolerance it's expected to run, you're going to have a condition where the valves do not fully seat or close properly. When I say fully seat, it means that the valve is not going to seal on your valve seat. And, rather they're going to stay open and not make proper contact with the valve seat. And basically this is what happens when we say the valves are too tight. And like I mentioned earlier, the valves do tend to get very hot, and most of the heat is going to be drawn out of the valve via the seat. So no contact means the valve is now beginning to overheat and burn. So you hear a lot of mechanics and technicians saying, the valve's burnt. They basically mean that the valves are going to overheat and the valve will eventually distort. And this is going to lead to, a larger and larger compression leak. So eventually you will need a complete head rebuild to rectify the problem. At this point, getting your valve clearances adjusted might not really do much, because valve and valve seat are already too damaged. And, your motorcycle performance will gradually feel poorer. Even before it reaches a stage where your valves are totally burnt and the seats are, recessed, you will find that there is quite, drop of power. The engine feels mushy. And so that was tight valves. And when you talk about loose valves, it's just the opposite. So with loose valves, you have too much of a clearance or gap between the valve stem and the camshaft. This won't necessarily cause excessive wear or anything like that, but you will find that there will be a ticking sound from the valve train. That's a ticking that a lot of people hear from the engines, as well as there will be a reduced performance. As the excess clearance is going to reduce your valve lift. So when that happens, cylinder filling is going to be inefficient. You're not going to get the amount of fuel and air mixture that you require inside your engine. So guys, I'm going to summarize this. So, you need to change your fuel filters at least at the specified interval. You got to clean your injectors at least every 35,000 kilometers. It may be less in some scenarios. And you got to at least check your valve clearances. Once you check your valve clearances, that's when you're going to know if you need to adjust your valve clearances. And if you do these three things, it's definitely going to aid, in increasing the longevity of your motorcycle engine and keep it performing at its best.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. I want to hear your stories, your motorcycle experiences, what you've been doing, and how motorcycles have made your life better. So if you have something to say, DM us on Instagram, and I'll be more than happy to get you on this podcast.